Welcome back, everybody.
There are ways that these categories interact with other categories.
We're not looking at
the creations of our own minds.
Yeah.
Welcome back. The next item on the agenda is the faculty panel on religion and government, a global perspective. Introductions of the panelists will be the first order of business for our moderator, Harvey Cox, who I'm sure in this room truly needs no introduction. So, Harvey, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tim. Well, welcome to the panel. Despite all predictions half a century ago, religion in the world has not become marginalized, has not disappeared, has not retreated into personal or domestic circles. Despite all those predictions of 50 years ago, religion plays, it would seem, a larger and larger role in what we call the public sphere. We welcome you all to this discussion today, this panel, where we're going to explore some aspects of what has now become obvious to anyone who glances at the first page of the New York Times. Someone once said you always had to turn to page 23 to find anything out about religion. Now it reaches out from you from every single first page of the Times and many other newspapers. All you have to do is look around the world. I'm going to tick off some of the evidence for this and then put a couple questions, which I hope our panel might take up. Virtually everywhere. The Orthodox Church in Russia, after decades and decades of oppression, now seems to be playing an increasing public role in the governance of Russia, and it is said that Mr. Putin now wears a cross around his neck, which would hardly have been the case with some of his predecessors. In Latin America, from which I've just returned, where, as you all know, Pentecostals and evangelicals are growing very, very rapidly, they are beginning to play a role in electoral politics, getting elected to office, to national legislative bodies, municipal bodies, and the rest. Where will all that lead? Think about Israel, where a growing ultra-Orthodox party now threatens what many secular Israelis feel might be the fabric of their society, and some of them even demanding what they call a Torah state, opening up a chasm between ultra-Orthodox and secular Israelis. What is the present status of the Islamic revolution in Iran after 20-some years? Seems to be questioned in some circles in Iran, and yet it seems still to be very influential. Perhaps even more interesting is our current developments in Turkey, which everyone had thought was an Islamic but a secular state, in which now strong Islamic movements are afoot, and one inspired by Islamic principles is now actually in power. The United States, of course, what is the status of the return or the ascendancy of the religious right in America? Is it beginning to peak? Is it fragmenting? What kind of influence does it actually wield other than simply rhetorical influence? Just a few weeks ago, we saw a picture of the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Koizumi, visiting and praying at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, a Shintoist shrine, much to the chagrin of the religious minorities in Japan, the Buddhists and the Christians, and also much to the disappointment of the democratically inclined people in Japan who are afraid of a new nationalist type of Shinto. In China, the Bharata Janata Hindu party was in power, now out of power, but certainly not disappearing. And think about China, where everyone now realizes that the overall myth of communism is dead. There are religious movements, Christian and otherwise, at the grassroots and among intellectuals all around the world. This is what is happening. And religion is not just in the private sector, as I said, but very, very public, for blessing or for bane. So we have here a panel to help us look around the world and look into history, to enlarge the purview of this question. And I'm going to introduce them for a moment, but here are some of the questions I have in mind. I don't think they can probably answer all of them, but at least they're the ones I have in mind, and I think you may have in mind too. Is what I've just described an illusion, a blip, what someone had once called the last roseate flush of religion on the cheek of a dying patient? Nice phrase. Is that actually the case, or is it something more significant and perhaps even more permanent as a part of our global life? If it is real, why has it happened? Why has this unexpected turn of events taken place in the last 50 or 60 years? Something hardly anyone, I think, anticipated. We hear a lot about the failure of the promise of modernity, but what in the world does that actually mean? Is that anything like an explanation? How does this resurgence of religion in the public sphere differ from area to area around the world and within particular religions and from religion to religion? Let us be careful not to generalize about it. What can we learn from previous centuries of religion and government relations that might help us understand what is happening today? Now, that's a very, very large agenda. And I have a class I meet at 12, so I'm going to creep out here just as they're getting to all the juiciest answers on this panel. But I'm going to get them started now, and I want to say a word or two about each of our three panelists. Full information is right here next to their pictures on your program, and they'll speak in the following order for 10 minutes each. Our first is Professor Barbara Johansen, Professor of Islamic Religious Studies here at Harvard Divinity School. He's just arrived from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He had previously taught at the Center for the Free University, Islamic Studies at the Free University of Berlin. He's especially interested in the relationship between Islam and legal practices, and especially how how those practices empower or, in some cases, delimit the role of lay people. Amy Hollywood, Monrad Professor of Christian Studies, is especially interested in mysticism and has written a couple of books about Christian mysticism, relating it to psychoanalysis, feminism, and current French philosophy. And she is now, I'm told, writing a book about memory and mourning and Christian mysticism. And finally, we will hear from Michael Jackson, visiting professor of world religions. I think of Michael as a kind of hands-on researcher, what is sometimes called ethnography, where he, instead of simply studying about things, he actually wades in and meets and talks with and participates with people, and he has a special interest in the relationship between religion and violence. So let's begin with Barbara Johansen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to thank my colleagues for giving me the privilege of addressing such a learned, intelligent, motivated, and interesting audience. I'm very grateful for having been given this chance. This semester I'm teaching a course on mosques in Muslim history, and I will take an example from that course and talk about the relations between international health organizations and mosque communities in Africa and the Near East. The capacity of many states to sustain viable health services for their citizens has weakened over the last 10 years. While this is true for very rich states in the West, it is all the more true for states in Africa and the Near East. These states lack the capacity to provide the big investments necessary to take care of their growing population. And they are, in addition, weakened through the pressure of international organizations that impose on them politics of privatization, of cuts in expenditure, and that means of the reduction in state functions. Since the 70s of the 20th century, most of these states saw the emergence of strong movements that, in the name of Islam, confronted the state and its social policy. These Islamist opposition movements see the failure of the states in Africa and the Near East to ensure a rapid modernization of the society and the economy as a consequence of the fact that these states are too much oriented towards Western models of state building. The Islamist movements choose the social services as the field in which they compete with these state apparatus for the ideological leadership in the society. Their networks therefore organize social services such as nurseries, clinics, daycare, schools for the Muslim population. Mosques, traditionally integrated into the social structure of Near Eastern cities and villages, serve as nodal points for these new networks. They add the new service dimension to their traditional role of defining locally and for the members of their mosque communities what it means to lead a life according to Islamic principles. In an interesting and informative article, Roux describes the result in the following words, I quote, "Many private mosques have expanded into services that compete directly with less efficient and lower quality public services. Services may include the provision of subsidized clothing and food, healthcare, regular educational programs, usually at the pre-primary or primary level, after-school tutoring for children, religious instruction, subsidies for students, evening courses, social group activities. In poor areas, mosque representatives hand out free food, clothing and money in exchange, as one woman puts it, for wearing our Islamic dress." Unquote. The mosques play a major role in this Islamic service sector, and the Islamist movement claim the ideological hegemony and control over this service sector. In 2003, a major confrontation between the World Health Organization and the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs in northern Nigeria underlined the position of strength from which the Islamist organizations act in the health sector. While the World Health Organization organized a countrywide vaccination campaign against polio that was meant to eradicate this sickness from Nigeria, I quote from Ibn Ezer Obadar, "The Supreme Council of Islamic, so it's a quotation now, the Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs claimed to have learned from some internet websites that the oral polio vaccine championed by the WHO and the United Children's Fund had been deliberately contaminated with carcinogenic, anti-fertility, and AIDS-inducing agents." Still quotation. "The Supreme Council of Islamic Affairs embarked on a campaign to stop the immunization exercises in the north of Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim, pending an official investigation and an assurance that the vaccines were free of alleged contaminations." Unquote. The BBC reported that Dr. Dati Ahmed, quote, who is both a medical doctor and the president of Nigeria's Supreme Council for Sharia law, said they needed to check reports that the vaccine was contaminated, unquote. "There were strong reasons," he said, quote, "to believe that the polio immunization vaccine was contaminated with anti-fertility drugs, contaminated with certain viruses that cause HIV, AIDS, contaminated with simian virus that are likely to cause cancers," unquote. He told the BBC World Service News Hour program. The result was that the vaccination campaign was called off by the state authorities, that polio spread again into the south of Nigeria and in some of the neighboring states that had been polio-free since 18 months. According to the New York Times of August 30, 2005, Indonesia, a state that was polio-free since 1995, lived from March 2005 on through a polio epidemic that struck 225 children. The newspaper reports that the polio virus in Indonesia is traceable to Nigeria. I can't check that. They invoke a genetical analysis of the virus as the source of that evaluation. Now, the World Health Organization did not react to this state in a polemic. They did not say these people are responsible for. They correctly, I think, concluded that what is at stake is that the people to be vaccinated did not trust the World Health Organizations, nor the state authorities who sponsored the vaccination campaign. So the World Health Organization concluded that the failure of the 2003 vaccination campaign in Nigeria was due to a lack of trust of the northern Nigerians in the state administration and the World Health Organization's activity. In a leaflet called Frequently Asked Questions About Polio, the World Health Organization Nigeria gives as one of the reasons that prevent Nigeria from eradicating polio, I quote, the insufficient public trust in polio immunization. This public mistrust is due to discrimination, poverty, and other major health priorities going unaddressed. In the same leaflet, the WHO Nigeria suggests how this lack of trust would be overcome. And I quote again, they ask, what is the role of religious leaders in eradicating polio from Nigeria? And they answer, religious leaders are the most respected members of the society and custodians of the holy faith. Their stand in society and their words are treasured by all well-meaning people. Religious leaders play a critical role in creating awareness amongst the people to immunize their children against polio. Religious leaders support communities and districts to plan and conduct polio campaign. Religious leaders play a key role in educating their constituents through announcement in mosques and churches about the need to eradicate polio, unquote. Religious leaders in mosques are, in this argument, recognized as forces that can mobilize trust that the WHO and the Nigerian state need in order to fulfill their tasks in the health sector. In fact, the practice of the World Health Organizations in other Muslim countries points to the same conclusion. In 2000, the World Health Organization's regional office of the Eastern Mediterranean led its anti-tobacco campaign in Egypt, diffusing a publication called Islamic Ruling on Smoking, that was issued by the Grand Mufti of Egypt and was summarized and approved by this religious dignitary and the Ministry of Pious Foundations. I quote, again, from the information that the World Health Organization distributes, a plan of action was developed in the regional office to distribute the Islamic ruling to all mosques in Egypt. Egypt was selected because of the large number of mosques in this country. The regional office prepared 80,000 posters of the summarized ruling. A private organization was contracted to distribute the ruling all over Egypt in 5 days. The effect of distributing the poster was very encouraging, and the regional office received requests from other countries to distribute the poster in their mosques, unquote. In spite of this success, several members of the World Health Organizations engaged in this campaign have raised objections. They fear that the religious ties that the World Health Organization and the state accept in this kind of partnership with the mosques might lead state and international organization into religious proselytism or into religious conflicts. This fear is not entirely without justification. I leave that for the discussion. For a world religion, this new situation seems to restore in a new form one of the oldest competences and tasks of religion, to protect the human body and to control the access to it. For the World Health Organization, the situation may be more ambiguous. It has to defend its task in religious and not mainly in medical terms. And it risks of being drawn into interreligious conflicts. States that accept the new situation risk to find their relation with their citizens mediated by religious institutions. For the patients concerned, as the example shows, this development is not without risks. For us, it means that we have to follow closely the forms and results of globalization in order to grasp the effects it exerts on the capacity to act of the other actors in the field, states, science, and international organizations. Thank you very much.
I want to say something simple about a very complex issue, which makes me nervous at the outset. I'm used to saying overly complex things about what are essentially simple issues, as all academics are. So what I want to start with is two ends of the U.S. Christian spectrum in terms of claims about prophetic authority for political action. And I'm just going to start with two quotations, and then that will lead us back to the Middle Ages. How we do that, you'll see. Mark Lewis Taylor, who's a theologian who teaches at Princeton Theological Union, has a book that just came out called Religion, Politics, and the Christian Right, Post-9/11 Powers and American Empire. And it's really a plea for an anti-U.S. imperialist and a theology that comes out of a stance that is against U.S. imperialism, that's against global capitalism, and that wants to call upon what he calls the prophetic spirit as a voice through which this kind of political action can be engaged in by American citizens. In the course of the first chapter of the book, and I actually haven't read the entire book yet, it really just came out, he defines prophetic spirit the following way. He says, prophetic spirit is a cultural political current that uses mythic languages, art, and political practices to create justice and peace for the weak, for the marginalized and oppressed, without whose emancipation the whole body politic lives in travail. Here we have the call for the mythopoetic language, as well as art and mythopoetically engendered forms of political practice as the site of a kind of political agency. And in the case of Mark Lewis Taylor, it's a political agency on behalf of the weak and the oppressed that he sees as part of a leftist political agenda in the U.S. Operation Rescue, which is a pro-life organization that has had many splits over the course of the last 10 years, but in one of its recent incarnations, held a solemn assembly in Buffalo in 1999. And at this solemn assembly, a leaflet was passed out and read, and what was in the leaflet was read and chanted by the rather small crowd who was there for the event. And the leaflet, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it goes something like this. All the power and wealth of the town of West Seneca, all the power and wealth of the city of Lockport, all the power and wealth of the town of Amherst, these are all the surrounding towns, I'm assuming, to Buffalo, all the power and wealth of the town of Tonawanda, all the power and wealth of the city of Rochester, all the power and wealth of the city of Buffalo, all the power and wealth of Marilyn Buckham. I don't know who she is. I don't know why they were worried about her. But anyway, all the power and wealth of the University of Buffalo, all the power and wealth of Planned Parenthood, all the power and wealth of the U.S. District Court, all the power and wealth of the state of New York, Spitzer, Pataki, Silver, all the power and wealth of the United States of America versus the Church of Jesus Christ. The Operation Rescue chant, all the power and wealth, resonates with, and is drawn from the same kind of prophetic traditions that Taylor wants to draw on. And in fact, one of the claims that's made throughout the Operation Rescue literature, as in much of the pro-life literature, is precisely the claim about the weak on behalf of whom the pro-life movement must act and speak and engage in political activities is precisely, or those weak are precisely the unborn in the rhetoric of the pro-life movement, or in the language of the pro-life movement. So one of the questions that's operative in this sort of stage debate, I mean, Mark Taylor and Terry Quinn aren't actually engaged in any active debate that I know of, but in the stage debate that I'm putting forward, one of the debates over who has prophetic authority is who speaks for the weak, which is a debate about who is the weak, who constitutes the weak within the context of the United States. What this raises for me is a question about how to think about claims to prophetic authority within the context of U.S. democracy. It's historically clearly been the case that prophecy has been called upon to provide precisely, I was thinking about Larry Summers' comments earlier, provide precisely a kind of mythopoetic power to political actions, to political agency. We see this in the actions of white and black abolitionists in the 19th century. We see it in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, most famously, perhaps. We see it in the contemporary pro-life movement. We see it in contemporary movements against imperialism and anti-capitalism in the context of contemporary U.S. culture. In all of these movements, we see an appeal to the prophetic traditions of the Jewish and Christian traditions. And one of the things I'm interested in is to what extent there's similar kinds of claims made on behalf of Islamic prophetic traditions within the United States. I just don't know the answer to that question. There are those who insist, when you ask the question about, okay, what role should prophetic claims to authority have within the context of the U.S. political sphere? There's one line of argument that insists that democracy and prophetic claims are simply antithetical to each other. So that Bruce Lincoln, for example, and others have argued that any claim to divine authority for one's own assertions removes you from the political sphere of democracy, precisely because you are ascribing authority to the divine and therefore removing your own claims from any kind of engagement in rational public debate. And that rational public debate is seen as essential to democratic governance, and therefore prophetic claims resting on divine authority are seen as lying outside of the realm of the rational discourse that is important to the democratic sphere. Within that line of argument, one of the readings of the civil rights movement and the work of Martin Luther King, for example, is to say, well, he did make use of the prophetic voice, but he also made use of the prophetic voice within a context that also made made natural law arguments that could be heard within a democratic public sphere, and so that we can separate out, according to these kinds of critics, his prophetic voice from another kind of voice that fits with democratic polity, and therefore understand the gains that were made by the civil rights movement, not just by Martin Luther King, but by the larger movements. It seems to me that that's a problematic issue. And one of the things I want to do, or the thing I really want to do, the simple thing I want to do, is go back to one medieval example of the appeal to prophetic power on behalf of the weak in this instance, to ask the question about whether it's the claim that prophetic authority is divinely sanctioned authority and therefore not subject to any kind of rational debate or any kind of public debate is in fact an accurate one. The example, and we're moving to a totally different world, is the 13th century. It's the writing of she's one woman among many that I could have picked. Mechthild of Magdeburg, a German Dominican. Well, she actually wasn't a Dominican, I'm sorry. She was a Beguine, but she was a semi-religious woman. She lived alone, life dedicated to poverty, chastity, obedience, but outside of the auspices of any given religious order. She was, in fact, very devoted to the Dominican order, to the order of preachers, but was not herself a Dominican.
Could you give her name again?
Yes, Mechthild of Magdeburg. I'm sorry, that's not a name that people run into every day, I realize. She wrote a book called The Flowing Light of the Godhead, which is in 7 parts, and rests upon her claims to speak the word of God in this text. There was a Latin translation made of her book in the years that when she was still alive. It's only the first 6 books of the Flowing Light of the Godhead that were translated in her lifetime. And there's a prologue to that Latin translation, which tries to, on her behalf, justify her writing activity. The author of the prologue compares her to Deborah from Judges 4:4-5. Deborah was the prophetess who told Barak to go after the Canaanites and to go after the Canaanite general Sisera and said, you will win. And Barak said, well, you have to come with me. And she said, okay, but if I go with you, it's going to be said that Deborah and Barak won, not just Barak won. And he says, okay, I need you anyway. And so she went, and therefore she gets to be named as having defeated Sisera, as well as Jael, who was a woman who also was important in the defeat of Sisera. Deborah was said to be full of the spirit of prophecy and was, in the time of the judges, said to be one of the prophets of the people of Israel. The other prophet to whom Mechthild is compared by this unnamed Latin author is Huldah from 2 Kings 22:14-20. And Huldah was also said to be a prophetess. She was a prophetess who lived in Jerusalem and who, according to the 2 Kings, enlightened by the Holy Spirit as to the hidden judgment of God, informed the holy king Hosea about the coming scourges of the people. People were being bad, not properly worshiping God, not holding to the covenant in the ways demanded, and were going to be punished unless they followed Hosea, who was himself faithful, in returning to faithfulness to the covenant. The author of the Latin prologue to Mechthild of Magdeburg's book points out that there were in fact priests, high priests, and there were those learned in the law, i.e. men, available for God to speak to in the time of Deborah and Huldah. But despite this, the Holy Spirit chose to reveal his secrets, this is the Latin author, to holy women of the weak sex. His phrasing. Quite often, in fact, the prologue goes on to say, Almighty God has chosen what is weak in the world to confound what is strong. and it does so for its own good. This is only a pale reflection of the claims that Mechthild makes for herself. He says, you're like Huldah and Deborah. He, we're presuming the Latin author of the translation, and the prologue was a man. Maybe not, maybe he or she. But anyway, they claim you're like Huldah and Deborah. Mechthild claims in a infamous or famous, depending on your point of view, chapter of The Flowing Light, that her writing and her prophetic role is like that of Moses, author of the Pentateuch, David, author of the Psalms, Solomon, the author of the 3 wisdom books, and Jeremiah and Daniel, 2 of the most important of the biblical prophets. So she's claiming much higher company for herself than is the author of the prologue. In the process of making those claims for her own higher prophetic authority, Mechthild prophesies to not only religious leaders. She tells the Pope at one point, you should only let Dominicans preach. Not sure why, but there you go. I mean, I do know why, but we won't go into it. And she also speaks to secular leaders, who she understands as necessarily supporting the religious function of the popes. So despite the fact that Deborah and Huldah lived in times of a theocratic government in which God ruled through king, priest, and prophet, and so therefore claims to God's authority on their part were claims to command armies, were claims to rule the state, were claims to determine what the king should do. Mechthild was living not in a theocracy, in a time when there is a separation between church and state, and yet at the same time she's operating with theocratic principles in mind. And her presumption is always that the secular leaders should, in fact, be doing what the Pope does, and she should be telling the Pope what to do, so therefore she should be telling everybody what to do. I mean, that's sort of the logic operating in her text. She thinks that the end times are coming, just as a background, and she believes that the Holy Spirit, the time of the Holy Spirit is coming, that the Dominicans are going to bring about the time of the Holy Spirit, and that the Pope must do everything to support the Dominicans in that process. The reason I bring up this example is because there's a question about, already in the time of Mechthild's writing, questions about whether her claims to divine authorship should be accepted as legitimate. That there are intense debates about the authority of claims like those made by Mechthild of Magdeburg and other women already in the 13th to 15th century. The issue is, when are the claims of weak women to divine authority legitimate, and who gets to decide? And there's a complex set of debates that emerge to determine what constitutes real prophecy and what constitutes a message given through real prophecy that should be accepted. I think that that's important for contemporary debates for the following reason. Just very quickly to wrap this up. This medieval example, I think, can help us see that in the context of contemporary prophecy, there's 2 questions that have to be asked, and one is an interreligious question and one is a civic question. The interreligious question is whether the prophetic claims made by a particular person or group are in fact really prophetic within the context of the religious traditions about which and to which they claim to speak. But that also implies, both interreligiously and civically, the ability to contest the substance of the claims themselves, and to contest the substance of the claims themselves on not only religious, but also on ethical, political, moral grounds. That seems to me to be the place where civil society always will protect itself, even as it's able to hear and be informed by prophetic voices. That's the gambit I'm putting forward today. Lots of questions to be raised about it that I'll leave for you.
Thank you.
Some of my recent work has been on how people conceptualize the state in Sierra Leone, West Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia, particularly the notion of the state as a proto-parent. As psychoanalysis shows, that parents tend to be regarded ambivalently, providers as well as withholders of care. While many people would find it hard to conceive of the body politic without imagining that it at least held the potentiality to care for them in crisis and protect their rights, in other words, to obey the same principle of reciprocity that obtains in the bosom of the family or community, few would consider it realistic to model the modern state on the morality of the family. As Hannah Arendt observed, love by its very nature is unworldly, and it is for this reason, rather than its rarity, that it is not only apolitical but anti-political, perhaps the most powerful of all anti-political forces. Yet it is true, I think, that insofar as the family conjures images of both maternal care and patriarchal control, this ambiguity is carried over into images of the state, which is imagined to possess the pastoral capacity for forgiveness, care, and love we associate with the maternal domus, as well as the unequal power relations we associate with the patriarchal polis. For people who have suffered the historical trauma of conquest and colonization, it is often hard to see the benign potentiality of the state as the good breast. Maori New Zealanders are educationally and medically far worse off than New Zealanders of European descent, of whom I am one. And far more of their young people are in prison. And many explain their disadvantaged position as a direct effect of colonization, regarding everything from European schooling to drugs and alcohol as destructive of their cultural and life essence. For them, the New Zealand state is a bad breast, associated with materialism, indifference, and double-dealing. And they take refuge in the belief that the recovery of their spiritual heritage through speaking their language, repossessing their stolen lands, and separating themselves from European mores is the only way they can heal and re-empower themselves. Yet this contrast between Maori as spiritual and the West as material does not reflect any empirical or historical reality. It is a construction in which both colonizer and colonized are complicit, a construction that explains socio-economic inequalities between the two in terms of mutually inimical cultural essences. What are the entailments of these forms of cultural fundamentalism? For the powerful, they justify the dismissal of the pleas of First Nations peoples for social justice on the grounds that these are based on values and beliefs that are pre-rational and antiquated, hence inimical to economic progress and the general good. As one Maori writer noted, there is little recognition that the Maori world is anything other than a cultural object noted for its spirituality and its music. For those who feel powerless, colonized, and marginalized, these forms of cultural fundamentalism bolster a sense of solidarity, recapturing in notions of a shared cultural essence and political struggle something of the integrity, authenticity, and sense of purpose they have lost. But this comes at a price, for by echoing the prejudice of the powerful, who persist in seeing First Nations peoples as essentially other, and explicating this difference in terms of absolute contrasts between emotion and reason, or spirituality and materiality, the powerless perpetuate the discursive distinctions that have contributed to their marginalization. In Aboriginal Australia, claims to land that was lost in the course of colonization can only be made under land rights and native title legislation that demands that spiritual ties to traditional land, including sacred sites, must be demonstrated. Presently in New Zealand, Maori are fighting for custodial rights over the foreshore and seabed on the basis of the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, in which the British Crown guaranteed these rights. 2 years ago, in seeking to allay white anxieties that they would be banished from their beloved beaches if Maori custodial rights were confirmed, the government created a new public domain for People of New Zealand title, coining the term ancestral connection to help Maori identify their rights to take stones for making earth ovens or protecting burial sites if they felt these were being infringed. For many Maori, the invention of this new phrase, ancestral connection, implied that their original rights under the Treaty of Waitangi were being ignored, and their values made secondary to national interests which remained Eurocentrically defined. Like spiritual connection, ancestral connection implies something of a double standard, in which Maori values, a euphemism for irrational or pre-scientific belief, are contrasted with the rational, scientific knowledge that is more in the national interest. Whether or not Maori believe that their feelings about their land imply a radically different worldview, they are driven to prosecute their claims for the land and for social justice in terms of a discursive framework that is biased toward the non-secular and is based on law, L-O-R-E, rather than law, L-A-W, religion rather than reason. Numerous ethnographies inform us that the traditional Maori saw the entire cosmos as comprising a network of relations of kinship and alliance that included all beings and all things, people, plants, animals, and the elements. The primal parents of this plethora of forms, each of which possessed its own tikanga, or natural function, were Ranginui and Papatuanuku, respectively sky and earth. These days, Maori intellectuals sometimes make sweeping generalizations about the differences between indigenous and non-indigenous worldviews, arguing that conflicts over the meaning of land tenure and land rights are grounded in differences between spiritual and material attitudes toward nature. In the words of one notable Maori scholar, Maori people do not see themselves as separate from nature, humanity, and the natural world, being direct descendants of Earth Mother. Thus, the resources of the earth do not belong to humankind, rather, humans belong to the earth. While humans, as well as animals, birds, fish, and trees, can harvest the bounty of Earth's resources, they do not own them. Instead, humans have user rights. A year after the introduction of genetic technology to New Zealand in 2003, I met the author of that statement of Maori cosmology in Auckland, and over dinner asked him how many Maori, in his view, embraced such a belief about not intermingling the genes of different species. I took care to explain that I was not calling these beliefs into question. Rather, I was curious to know to what extent these beliefs were politically rather than culturally motivated. In other words, did people hold these beliefs to be true because they simply could not comprehend the world in any other way? Or did they espouse these beliefs for the sense of solidarity and common cause they provided in the face of a dominant Eurocentric and allegedly scientific worldview which they felt they did not control or comprehend? Monica Henare made 2 points. First, he observed that relatively few Maori are radically opposed to genetic engineering on a priori cultural or cosmological grounds. However, most will speak against it, saying no at first because they are wary of being railroaded into giving their assent to something that may prove later to be to their detriment. People are conservative and cautious, Monica said, because Pakeha, that's New Zealanders of European descent, have ridden roughshod over their intellectual and cultural property rights in the past. Their policy is, therefore, to go slow, to wait and see how things work out, how the land lies, before rushing into anything. Monica's second point was that Maori attitudes to genetic engineering are context-dependent. He described to me a Maori gathering at which he asked people to raise their hands if they were diabetic and using insulin. As Monica expected, a large number of people raised their hands. He then asked how many people were against genetic engineering. All were against it. Monica then told his audience that insulin was produced through genetic engineering. How many people, he now asked, would continue using insulin? All said they would. If it's a life and death issue, Monica said, one will set aside one's ideological arguments against genetic engineering. that cultural beliefs or moral convictions are often compromised or bracketed out when they conflict with the existential imperatives of individual or ethnic survival does not invalidate the beliefs. Rather, it challenges us to see beliefs not as binding, but as a repertoire of potential ideas that we may use in addressing the situations in which we find ourselves, particularly those in which the power of the state radically undermines our claims to citizenship. Thank
you. Well, thank you, all of you. This has been a both sweeping and penetrating panel, raising all kinds of questions at various levels, historical, global. And I now open the floor for your questions. You can simply direct them to any member of the panel. I'll call on you. We have somebody with a microphone here and somebody here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. You said at the beginning, I think I quote you correctly, that few would consider modeling the state on the ethics of the family. It seems to me that the ethics of the states that I have anything to do with really come from the family. Can you explain yourself?
Well, as Johann Habermas has pointed out, the modern state originates, or is initially modeled after intimate community relations. But I think, as Weber most famously pointed out, the modern state is characterized by bureaucratic structures, which mean that it works with stereotypes. It does not address people as individuals, and it cannot, therefore, operate with the principles of morality that operate in the family. Even though, as I said, people, in my experience, in a variety of settings, persist in imagining the state in such terms. So that, to me, is the most important fact, not whether one can establish objectively that the state is or is not family-like.
I wonder if you would care to comment on the phrase which is used especially by neoconservatives, a very critical phrase when they talk about the nanny state, which they obviously do not like, and accuse the state of being. Is there a difference between a nanny and a parent?
Well, having been raised in a welfare state, what Foucault would call a pastoral state, and having lived the last 6 years in one in Denmark, what has struck me is that even though the welfare state is characterized in these terms, it's not experienced by people in these terms. It's seen as a bureaucratic state which frustrates people's desire for care. The stories you hear when people go to the state-funded medical services or attend state-funded schools is that they're just treated indifferently. It's curious, because in material terms, they're much better off than people that aren't living in welfare states. But in spiritual terms, as it were, they feel they're not getting their money's worth.
Other questions? Yes, back here. Yes, sir.
Bill Nitze again. I found the presentations fascinating, particularly the disconnect between the realities of the beneficial fruits of modern science and exploration and the feelings of many people who are not fully benefiting from those fruits. And it appears to me that we risk a vicious cycle here where disillusionment and distrust lead to a growing gap between those people who most need the fruits of modern science and they're actually receiving those fruits, and that their decline in social conditions and increased radicalization further accentuates their rejection. And so you really have a kind of emotional dynamic that leads to a further separation of two worlds, which become increasingly difficult to knit back together.
That might be something you'd want to address, Barbara. Actually, I was curious when you talked about the Muslim distrust of the Western influence form of the state, what it is in particular that is distrusted about that influence, and does it have much to do with the whole image that
yeah, well, on the one hand, it is. I mean, I was struck when Michael Jackson spoke about the claim to spiritual heritage as being the contrast under which you can unite your own culture, past, society. That's, of course, what has happened in Muslim discourse since the beginning of the 20th century, and all over, in practically all societies, Muslim societies I know. There has been developed the discourse which it assigns to the Western state, the Western society, rationality, materialism, and egotism, and claims for the Muslim world the capacity to rational thinking, even though there is a period of history in which that was not fully exercised, but a strong spiritual and altruistic heritage, which finally will clearly distinguish it from the West. So what is reproached to the state is, first of all, these states, is their failure to realize, to make good on their promises. If you think of the 50s, all over the Muslim world, 50s and 60s, you had dictatorships that promised a very quick development in terms of social security, material efforts, dike building, dam building, raising the productivity of the country, etc. I studied in Cairo at that time, and I can tell you that that was a general expectation, that things would go very quickly now. Now, things didn't go quickly, and the disappointment was of such a quality that it's a lasting effect ever since. The memory of the broken promise of the state is still valid, is still the central background against which all new efforts to create new promises have to be, I think, interpreted. So the false promise is embodied in the Western model of rationality, of using procedures and trusting them that are separated from the religious values of the Muslim society. And the state incorporates this. The state, later since the 80s, tends to defend itself, even the 70s, tends to defend itself by saying, no, we are also Muslim. This is not a secular state. This is an Islamic state. So you have in practically all Arab constitutions since the 70s, you have an article which is either Article 1 or 2, which says that the principles of the sacred law of the Muslim normativity are the main source for the national legislation. And so the state defends itself in these terms, but it is not credible because its own practice does not lead to a quicker development of modernity structures. And if you look at what people experience daily, that is social services. Right. That is the decline of the quarter, decline of housing, decline of medical care. That's where the state is measured, and his promises are clearly not fulfilled. And that is where the potential of disappointment grows daily. And the second one is, of course, that there is no free discourse in public. We just had the Egyptian presidential elections with all their accompanying circumstances. So you have it's a daily renewed disappointment with a state that grows and that is the background for the interpretation of the movements that oppose the state in the name of Islam.
Other questions? Way in the back there. Yes. Wait till we get the mic to you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. For Professor Hollywood, how, in your opinion, did this marvelous non-Dominican prophetess, how in the 13th century did she become literate, educated, knowledgeable, and aware of that role and calling in her purpose, in her writing and whatever else she did? How did it happen for her?
Yeah. I mean, she's not absolutely singular. She's somewhat singular, but she's not absolutely singular in the sense that there develops in the 12th century somewhat of a tradition of women making claims to this kind of prophetic power. Women who are in the Benedictine or Cistercian orders, or then who are these semi-religious women who are Beguines, and then in the Dominican and Franciscan orders. So it's from the 12th through the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And one of the things you see in the 12th and 13th century is the sort of audacity of a set of claims being made, and then the reaction, reaction to the and with the support of certain male religious leaders, and then a kind of backing off on the part of the male religious leadership, an attempt to control and contain the claims made by some of these women. In terms of the concrete structures of education and of community that made it possible for somebody like Mechthild of Magdeburg to write and to prophesy and to engage in different kinds of mystical experiences. The Beguines themselves, who were, as I said, these semi-religious women who emerged in the Netherlands and then in Germany and France in the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, they were teachers. One of the ways they had to support themselves. Right, they're not living in convents where they're not wealthy women who endow convents who then are self-supporting and enclosed away from the world. They're in fact living in the world and supporting themselves if they're not themselves wealthy. And often even if they were wealthy, they gave up their wealth and then supported themselves. And they supported themselves in the textile industry in the Netherlands. They supported themselves through taking care of the sick and praying over the sick and praying over the dying. But they also supported themselves by starting elementary schools, and elementary schools in which there was the rudiments of learning to read and write in the vernaculars. And what you're talking about is the emergence of a mercantile class that wants and needs to read and write in the vernacular, and wants not only their little boys but also their little girls to be able to read and write in the vernaculars. And you weren't going to get that education for the most part from the monks who were teaching in Latin. And so there was evidence of women school teachers, women Beguine school teachers, who taught not only girls but also boys the rudiments of vernacular reading and writing. And Mechthild's text is itself in Middle Low German. It's a vernacular text. She says she doesn't know Latin. She probably understood some Latin, but she doesn't write in Latin, and she's not literate in Latin. And that's an important context for these women to emerge and for them to have a place within the civic society. To get back to our larger issue, they played an important role in the civic and economic society as religious leaders around times of death and illness, as educators, and as key components in the textile industry in the Netherlands. And that's one of the reasons that they're protected. The Beguines actually get shut down as a movement in Germany pretty much entirely in the 14th century. The Netherlands, they survive until the 18th and 19th century because they were so important economically and educationally.
Thank you. Yes. Here's a question right here, please. This will be our last question.
Jerry Roach. I'm reminded of that famous line of Joan of Arc when she was in the dock, and this is actually taken from the transcript. But when the cardinal asked her, Joan, does God talk to you? And she said, yes. And he said, don't you think that's only in your imagination? And she responded with classic words, how else do you think God talks to us? I'd like to ask Professor Hollywood if what's the market out there today for modern mystics, or are we to depend? Are we to depend on the internet and the New York Times?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. How else do you think God talks to us? Yeah, that's right. I think that's part of what led me to make the particular set of comments I wanted to make today, is that I think there's a danger among that we shut down, that in the fear of the religious, in the fear on the part of some of us, I should be careful here, about the claims of the religious right and the religious Christian right in the context of the United States and other kinds of movements in other parts of the world, that we shut down the space for religious voices within the political sphere, and that there's a certain reading of what the separation of church and state means within the context, what disestablishment means within the context of the United States, that people want to put forward that would work to shut down the role of religious voices as motivating factors, not in terms of religious action and in terms of the content of what is in terms of political action and in terms of the content of what is spoken politically. And I guess part of what I was trying to suggest is that there's ways in which we can maintain the civil sphere as a place in which any religious claims are subject to democratic debate, but that doesn't mean that some of the claims that can be brought to the table are those that come from someone to whom God is speaking to through their imagination, right? We may not accept their claims about the source of their utterances. We may not accept the claims about the claims that they make on the basis of this divine authority, but to preclude at the outset anyone being able to enter into the political sphere saying what I have to say, I'm saying out of out of a religious sense of what God says to me, seems to me to be severely impoverishing of the contemporary political sphere. If that makes sense. I think there's those voices out there. I just want them. I wish they were coming from more sides. So part of it.
This is. I wish we could go on with this very last point for a while. It's something that I happen to be very interested in, which is how one somehow creates a venue in which both religious right people who believe they speak from an inspired prophetic perspective and those from the other side of the spectrum can meet and talk with each other. And our Center for the Study of World Religions here has not really done very much of this. We've been interested in interreligious relations. But the first weekend in December of this year, we're having the first very small kind of experimental conversation with evangelicals who hold a kind of apocalyptic Armageddon view of where we're headed in history, and some who do not. We believe in a way that intra-religious conversation that you've just alluded to, Amy, is a very important, an increasingly important contribution, and we'd like to make some contribution to that. It's an important issue, and we'd like to make a contribution to it. And when people actually talk with each other and test out their claims, and maybe some modification will emerge, we're not entirely sure. Well, thank all of you. This has been a very informative, wonderful session. You haven't answered all of my questions, I'm afraid, but let's hope that the rest of the conference can address them and do what we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Amy and Barbara and Harvey, for yet another really interesting, stimulating discussion. We move on to lunch now, and the luncheon, there are 3 different luncheon discussions that will happen. When you registered, I believe you chose which one of the 3 you wanted to participate in, and I believe on your name tag you have a number which should correspond with whichever session you are going to participate in. Your room will match that number on the tag. Number 1 is for women, gender, and religion, which will be in the garden room. Number 2 is for religion and public education, which will be in the green room. And number 3 corresponds with religion, ethics, and economics, which will be in the blue room. And there are signs in the hallway out there that should help you get to the right room. We'll resume here at 2 o'clock for the alumni panel discussion entitled HDS, Shaping the Future of Religion and Leadership. Thanks.